from Wellcome's next door neighbours at UCL in London, Anna Garnett, Kyle Jordan and Daniel Bailey. Anna's the curator of the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology at UCL. She's previously worked at several local, national and university museums in the UK and as a ceramics and small finds specialist in Egypt and Sudan for over 10 years. Anna's PhD is from the University of Liverpool, and her research interests include the reconciliation of Egyptian and Sudanese objects, assemblages and archives, New Kingdom material culture, and object and archive-based teaching. Kyle Lewis Jordan is joining Anna today and is a disabled postgraduate student at UCL reading the archaeology and heritage of Egypt and the Middle East. He's previously completed a BA in ancient history and Egyptology, also at UCL, and his research interests broadly encompass themes of religion, magic and identity, with a specific focus on the role and significance of disability in Egyptian court society. Kyle is also passionate about museums and heritage. He's a keen volunteer at the Petrie Museum, as well as a member of the British Museum's Advisory Council. And last but certainly not least, Daniel Bailey is taking part in a voluntary project at the Petrie Museum, whilst also completing his Masters in the Archaeology and Heritage of Egypt and the Middle East at UCL. Previously, he studied for his undergraduate degree in Swansea, volunteering in the Egypt Centre. Daniel's main material interests lie with prehistoric northeastern Africa, especially Sudan and lithic material. So I will hand over to Anna, Kyle and Daniel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexandra. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you see me? Can you see the screen even? Not me necessarily. Wonderful. That's great. Well, thank you so much firstly to the organisers for having us here today. The conference so far has been just wonderful. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank in particular my wonderful volunteers, Kyle and Daniel, who you are going to hear from very soon. They've been working on a project with me as collections volunteers at the Petrie Museum for several months now around the Wellcome material and the Wellcome distribution. And I've learned so much from working with them. So it's a real pleasure to be able to be here today and speak with them. So what I'm going to do first is present a little on the background to the Wellcome collection at the Petrie Museum, to the distribution of the material, what I think I know about it. And then Kyle and Daniel will go on to present some short case studies of what is absolutely their detective work around the collection, around particular aspects of the Wellcome material in the Petrie Museum. I'd like to thank Ken in particular as well. Ken has really guided us through this project so far, which has been it's been a real joy and a privilege. And I'd like to thank Alexandra as well on the Transcribe Wellcome project, because again, you know, having your guidance through this project has really, for me in particular, it's really given me the support to be able to ensure that we're doing this properly. And I know that Kyle and Daniel are also very pleased with this, so thank you so much. I'd like to say before I start that I have all my windows closed, but the schools have just let out, so you may hear some happy but screaming children walking by my window, and if you do, I apologise. They're very much outside and not in my flat. Wonderful. And so yeah, just to let you know, this is very much in the early stages of investigating Wellcome at the Petrie Museum, but has been a fascinating project to kick off. I would also say during kind of term 3 in the summer term at UCL, the Petrie Museum has been closed for a major storage redevelopment project. So it's also been pretty tricky to be able to access the collection and the archive during this time. So I'm sure what you will see here today is us scratching the surface of what there is at the Petrie, particularly around the archival holdings, and hopefully will give you a real taste of the potential for further study and investigation of this material. So let's kick off. I'd like to start with this note. And I think it was Ken actually that put up a similar note yesterday, which I think was the same handwriting. So therefore, I could potentially attribute this to Georgina Russell from the Wellcome collection, but I'd be very happy, Ken, to be corrected on that. This note is part of the Wellcome archive holdings relating to the Petrie Museum, and it sort of sums up the situation in one small kind of card at the Petrie Museum. So there are three main stages to Wellcome coming to the Petrie Museum. This isn't kind of the exclusive timeline of the material, but these are the three key stages that I want to talk about today. So in 1964, the collection, the Egyptian collection, was received from the Wellcome to UCL, to the Petrie Museum. The entire Egyptian collection was presented to UCL. This is around 350 packing cases. You've heard about the many thousands of objects that this included from speakers yesterday and today. And so I'm just kind of giving the brief overview here, then I'm going to go into more detail. In 1972, this collection was dispersed, except what the Petrie Museum wanted to keep. So the Petrie Museum retained around 1,000 objects from the Wellcome bequest, including more than 600 objects from the site of Merowe in Sudan, and also objects relating to Petrie's excavations and the British School of Archaeology in Egypt. And I'll go on to tell you a little bit more about how there seems to be quite a clear focus on retaining objects from Sudan for the Petrie Museum, which I find particularly interesting. I love this note in particular, the one at the very bottom. It says 1968. Bulk of Petrie material accessions, but their accessions register gives no dates whatsoever underlined, not even a date of entry. This is in fact the case, continues to be the case, and continues to cause quite some problems for those studying the collection. Unfortunately, none of our object registers have a date of accession of register. So if this is indeed Georgina Russell, I absolutely sympathise with this situation. Like I said, this kind of sums up many of the stumbling blocks different researchers have had over the years when working with the Wellcome collection at the Petrie. But I'm really delighted that this project so far is starting to shed really vital light on some of these problems and find solutions. Like I said, the detective work aspect of this, this project, working with the Wellcome in general, is so important to be able to kind of hone those skills, as you've seen so far in this conference, with identifying numbers, identifying object labels, scraps of information attached to objects that might give you some hint about, you know, whether they're linked to Wellcome, which site they might have been from, which auction they might have been purchased at. It's all part of the fun. It's one of the best bits of the job, and it is incredibly important to be able to hone those skills. And that's something that I'm really pleased that Kyle and Daniel have done so well as part of this project. So the people. There were many more people behind the Wellcome collection at UCL, but I'd like to highlight these following three for their determination to process, document and display the Wellcome material at the Petrie. So on the left is Barbara Adams, curator at the Petrie Museum, who I'll talk about shortly. On the right is David Dixon. Now, you've heard a bit about him yesterday, particularly in Ken's presentation. David Dixon was appointed at UCL to classify the Wellcome objects at UCL on a Wellcome fellowship. He subsequently became a full lecturer and then honorary curator of the Petrie Museum. In Rosalind Janssen's fantastic history of Egyptology at UCL, she states that originally, so in around 1960, the Wellcome intended to sell the material to the United States. I'd love to know if anyone knows any more about this. And Janssen says that David Dixon brought advance notice of this to his old teacher, Professor Emery at UCL, who, feeling that it would be wrong if it left Britain, prevailed upon the trustees to present the entire assemblage to UCL. Now, again, scratching the surface of this at the very beginning of this research, and I'd be really keen to find more archival material, in particular correspondence that relates to that kind of initial transfer or discussions around the transfer before it came to UCL. So the Wellcome collection arrived, still housed in its 350 packing cases, having been in off-site storage since 1946. It was also accompanied by display cases, which I'll tell you a little bit about shortly. And David Dixon was only one of the people that worked on this huge assignment, but in particular tried to work with finding space in the Petrie Museum to house this material in its already very crowded storage cupboards. Apparently there was some discussion around actually adding a second story to the building just to be able to house this material. That never happened, happily, I think, for many reasons. So we have an awful lot to thank David Dixon for, as I know Swansea in particular do as well. And in the centre here is Harry Smith. He was the honorary curator of the Petrie Museum between 1963 and 1970, and also Edwards Professor of Egyptian Archaeology and Philology at UCL from 1970 to 1986. And he also worked very closely on the documentation of the Wellcome material. Now, in the late 1960s, the work on the Wellcome collection, of which Professor Smith, David Dixon and others eventually came to a complete standstill. And the bulk remains of the collection were stored in basements at UCL in a building called Foster Court, which is immediately opposite the Petrie Museum's entrance. Interestingly, the same basements where the part of the collection was kept during World War II. And also apparently, according to Rosalind Janssen, in an annex on Tottenham Court Road. I don't know any more about this, but I'd love to find out more. And so by the late 1960s, the situation as it was with all of these objects in the museum became so acute, and the proper utilisation of the Petrie collection so impeded that in 1970, Professor Smith agreed a dispersal scheme with the Wellcome trustees, only that material directly relating to the department's own interests being retained. So as I said, this was mainly objects from Sudan, which corresponded with Harry Smith's interest in particular. Also objects relating to Petrie's excavations and those of the British School of Archaeology in Egypt, but they formed a very small proportion of the material. So we at the Petrie Museum are so fortunate to hold much of the archival material relating to this distribution, including several typewritten and handwritten lists of the Wellcome material. This includes some of the crate lists from the 1960s distribution, also lists referring to the 1980s transfer of Wellcome material to UCL, which I'll talk about shortly. Some of these lists have Wellcome numbers, so that's quite helpful. But mainly they are general object descriptions, which are quite tricky to identify as particular objects in the collection. For example, ostraca. You know, not impossible, but very difficult to identify. And these are materials that unfortunately we haven't yet digitized in full. So after COVID, whenever that's going to be, hopefully soon, the Wellcome material in the archive will be an absolute priority to be digitized and to be made more widely available. This also includes the wonderful 6 volumes of Egyptian antiquities written by Boscawen that Ken presented yesterday, identified very recently in the Petrie Museum, such important documents. You know, we want to make these as accessible as possible. Now I have a Chinook helicopter flying over my flat. It's a funny day, apologies if you can hear that. So we also hold some of the Wellcome slips and other object cards. So we're very much still getting to grips, like I said, with the Wellcome archival holdings. These are snapshots of the 3 boxes of cards that we hold. Again, I wasn't able to access them for long over the summer due to our object move, but really hoping to go through these in proper detail from the new term onwards in the autumn. So we hold 3 categories of object card, those of welcome cards of objects in the Petrie Museum, no welcome cards but welcome numbers on objects, and no welcome cards or numbers on objects, but objects that have been identified as being linked with welcome, for example, through the sales catalogues. And I'll explain how that's been done in the recent past. Again, priority after COVID will be digitizing more of these documents, in particular continuing to work closely with Alexandra and the Transcribe Wellcome project, of course Ken at Swansea as well, just to see if we can fill any gaps with regards to their holdings of the object cards and the welcome slips, which of course would be fantastic. We also hold some archival material relating to welcome objects acquired through auction, through sale. So I won't go into too much detail here because this is something that Kyle and Daniel are both going to touch upon, and of course was something that Ken talked about in detail yesterday. But this includes, for example, the Mcgregor collection sale at Sotheby's in 1922. And this is an example of an object in the collection which helpfully has a tag on it that says bought at Sotheby's with the lot number X Mcgregor collection. We don't have many of these types of tags with the objects, but we do have some. So please watch this space for more information, particularly around these archival holdings. So moving on, I'd just like to talk about some of the sites that are represented by the welcome material in the Petrie Museum. The first is the site of Merowe in Sudan, which is where John Garstang and his team of Sudanese workforce worked from 1909 to 1914 on behalf of the University of Liverpool, where his teams of local workers excavated, among other finds, many sculptures and other objects with a mixed Merowitic Hellenistic style. And these types of objects in particular were favoured for the Petrie Museum collection to be retained. I also believe that's Garstang's wife in that photograph, Marie, but someone from Liverpool can correct me on that. Yes, indeed. She is also in the photograph, and apologies because I should know her name. I think it's Marie. So the object on the right here is a sandstone statue of a flute player from the site of the Royal Bath at Merowe. Unfortunately, now we only have the body, the head we used to hold in the collection, but it was reported missing in 1977. So it's believed that the object was stored on the back stairs of the Petrie Museum in kind of open storage. And at that time, it was possible to, that's where you would, the main entrance also was, that someone just picked it up and walked away with it, which is incredibly sad. But it's, you know, it's a really good example of why we kind of need to keep our eyes peeled as well for objects. Sorry, I don't know, what a day of noise around my flat. Objects such as these, which we may be able to kind of reconcile again in the future. These are other examples of objects from Merowe in the Petrie Museum collection. So on the left, this is a fragment of wall decoration, a kind of light green glazed terracotta disc. It's in this beautiful raised relief in a Hellenistic style of a woman's face. Again, also excavated by Garstang from the so-called bathhouse at Merowe. Garstang and his team also excavated a site called Palace 294 at Merowe, where he found a cachette with many high quality objects, mostly dating to the Napatan period in Sudan, so around 700 to 300 BC. And this includes the object in the middle here, a faience votive ankh inscribed with the name and epithets of a spelter. This is a real visitor favourite at the Petrie Museum, and it's always in the kind of top 10 object lists of visitors and of staff. We also have objects from the sites of Jebel Moya and Abu Ghali. So we heard a bit about Jebel Moya yesterday, so I won't go into too much detail here. But Henry Wellcome himself financed and was personally involved in the first excavations at the site of Jebel Moya, which is around 250 kilometers southeast of Khartoum. And this was over 4 seasons from 1910 to 1914. This is one of the largest mortuary complexes of a pastoral society in sub-Saharan Africa, where thousands of bodies were excavated from undisturbed, shallow graves. It was also a major settlement which became permanent and flourished around 500 to 100 BC. And objects from this site are spread across different collections, for example, including the Ashmolean Museum, the British Museum, and the Science Museum. What we hold really interestingly are the excavation reports of Jebel Moya and Abu Ghali with their book plates from the Wellcome Historical Medical Library, which I only imagine were retained because the objects from those sites were also kept in the Petrie Museum. So the staff decided to retain the excavation reports as well. We have a very small collection of objects from the site of Abu Ghali, which is a smaller site close to Jebel Moya, dates to the late Meroitic period, so around the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD, and was excavated by OGS Crawford in 1914 as part of the Wellcome excavations in the Sudan, which these excavation reports are part of. I'm going to speed on so that I give plenty of time for Kyle and Daniel. We also have some material from the 1930s EES seasons at Amarna and Almant. So these are, again, this is a very small aspect of the collection, but it's interesting that the Amarna material, for example, is mainly glass material. So while there are some stone reliefs and sculptural fragments, it seems that there was a particular interest in retaining glass objects from Amarna. This project is a fantastic example to try to learn more about our unprovenance examples of objects from the Wellcome collection, of which we have many, as I'm sure many of the collection staff here can also say the same for their own collections. And this includes one of our best known objects and another visitor favourite on the left here, a Sippus amulet showing Horus as a child standing on top of 2 crocodiles. If you go into the Petrie Museum today, you'll see many of the object labels from the Wellcome collection objects, say ? Provenance, no Wellcome number, no provenance. So we're hoping that as part of this project, we're going to be able to learn more about the background, the provenance to the collection. I mentioned that 10 large pyramid showcases were also presented to UCL in the 1960s as part of the distribution, and 1 flatbed showcase, which you can still see in the Petrie Museum today. This is an old image of the Petrie Museum, so the 2 cases on the outside of the gallery are still present in the museum, the 2 sets of cases. So if you're interested in the history of display, the Petrie Museum is a great place to see that. Now, finally, I mentioned Barbara Adams. So there was also a distribution of Wellcome material to UCL in the 1980s. And this is 475 objects in 14 crates, mainly from the site of Koptos, that Daniel's going to talk about shortly. And the listing of all this material in the Petrie Museum was undertaken by volunteers and overseen by Barbara Adams, who was the curator of the Petrie Museum for more than 36 years in the 1960s to the 1990s, somewhat of a hero of mine. And the huge piece of work to document the collection was completed around a year later, so around October 1981. We've got some fantastic examples of correspondence between Barbara Adams, in particular Barbara Adams and Georgina Russell from the Wellcome collection. For example, in one letter, Barbara Adams says, "I now have the voluntary worker attacking the messy Wellcome card index, sorting it into order and throwing out duplicate cards. then she can match it with the objects that are here. Not unlike, we're not throwing things away, but not unlike the sort of work that's going on again today. A little later, Barbara Adams states that her lady volunteer has not completed the task of checking the welcome material here. What I can say at present is that there are many cards for which we have no objects, and quite a few objects for which we have no cards. And finally, and then I really will hand over, Georgina Russell states in a general letter to recipients of welcome material that the Petrie Museum has cards for a large number of the objects which passed through its hands in the 1960s. And Barbara Adams says she will be happy to send you any cards she has if you will send her a list of numbers. So all the way through, this has very much been a collaborative effort between UCL and other institutions. And I'm very proud to say that this continues today. So please, I would like very much to hand over now first to Daniel and then to Kyle to talk a bit about the work that they've been doing on the Wellcome collection. Thank you, Daniel.
I've been looking at the lithic material from Coptos, which has then come via Wellcome. It is rather numerous in quantity. So there's like 260 records of lithics, which are attributed to Wellcome from Coptos. And they are typologically diverse. So you've got some scrapers, so you've got ovular and circular scrapers, as well as bifacial points, which are on the slide. Next slide, please. You've also got, there's two celts, so one of them is represented, and then there's also sickle blades. In addition to this, there are also cores, flakes, and other blade forms. The majority of the material is all chert or flint, and then you've got, there was two stone celts, and one of them is basalt. I'm not sure what the other one is. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the original context of these objects is at Coptos, with the material being excavated through Petrie's 1893 to 94 excavations, and this was funded by Jesse Horwath and Martin Kennard. The lithics themselves are from pits throughout the site. They're regularly labelled the pits in basal clay beneath the town, or so like it's throughout the site. And then you've got they were packed alongside the lions, and so you've got the lions are shown on the plan of the site as well. Because the lions are recorded in Petrie's diary, and they're a lot more noteworthy, that it's kind of been decided to like follow the post-excavation life through the lions as like a representation of this. Next slide, please. And so towards the post-excavation life, the lions were transported to the UK in 1894. At some point during this transportation, they've been made in a fragmentary nature. So you've got crates of like fragmentary limestone pieces. And then the material as a whole has been split three ways between Petrie, Kennard, and Horwath, with most of Horwath's going to Manchester Museum, and then Kennard's has been distributed a lot more diversely. And so moving forward to September of 1927, the lions are part of a Petrie transfer to the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. And part of like the causes for this seems to be Wellcome's financial support of Petrie's the SAA, and you've got also Mr. Malcolm rather, suggesting that they will repair the Coptos lions as well. So you've got two elements of why they may be moving. Between 1927 and 1980, the lions remain with Wellcome, and it becomes towards the end of this period, they almost get referred to as lost to some degree. At one point, one of the lions in Oxford is assumed to be one of the two Coptos lions. However, in 1980, you then get a bit of correspondence between Georgina Russell, who Anna mentioned, and Barbara Adams, and that is centered on a group of heterogeneous objects which arrived from Egypt in cases marked Coptos lions. And so Adams has then been to the Enfield stores and rediscovers the Coptos lions. And with the support of Harry Smith, the transfer is arranged. And so 258 chert objects and 2 stone celts, as shown in like the attachment from De Pere to Freeman, are then moved from the Wellcome to the Petrie. And then after this, between like 1980 and 1982, Richard Jeschke does the Lions restoration reconstruction process, and later they are then presented outside of the Provost's office at UCL. There is a minor complication with using the Coptos lions as the kind of guide for understanding the lithic material, however, in that although you've got clear evidence of them in the 1980 correspondence, the 1927 correspondence for September does not list the 260 chert and basalt objects. And so although there are other lithic objects listed in that transfer, these are not. And so looking at other potential ways that this material could have moved from the Petrie, or from Petrie's excavations rather, to the Wellcome, one potential option is that it was part of Martin Kennard's private collections, and that was then sold in July 1912, with some of those objects going to the Wellcome. However, I don't know for certain, and like that's something I want to look into in future. And any like information about this would be very much appreciated as well. Yeah, Kyle.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd first like to say my own thanks to Anna and Daniel for giving me the opportunity to work with them on the transcribed Wellcome project, and a big thank you to Ken from the Egypt Center and Alexandra from the Wellcome Collection for their insights and their organization of this fantastic conference. For the next 5 minutes, I'd like to talk to you all about a collection of funerary linen fragments that I worked on for the project, and why I think their story is a significant one for us to think about. I'll start by giving you an overview of the material. Then we will look at the story behind their provenance and acquisition, and through that I hope to put forward some reflective thoughts about this fragmentation of things in the past and its continuity in the present, and what this means for the future. Next slide, please. These 25 fragments of funerary linen and wrappings, which were gifted to the Petrie from the Wellcome collection in the 1980s, all date from the 30th dynasty and feature notable inscriptions from the Books of the Dead. Along with these, we also find a few pieces with demotic numbering, denoting their place in the sequence of bandages. So for example, you can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, UC 32435. In the bottom left edge of that piece, we have the number 19 inscribed in demotic. So it's quite likely that many of these were taken from mummified remains. There are also a number of named individuals on these pieces whose names I've included on the slides. All these fragments have been cut up and placed onto old card, and as we can see, there has been a significant amount of ripping, tearing, and staining. Next slide, please. So as you can see, here are a few more of the pieces that also have named individuals. Next slide. And a few more. Note that UC 32454 on the left-hand side of the screen also has a demotic numbering of 6th in its, I believe, left-hand corner as well. Now, one thing that's worth noting about these fragments is that apart from the oops, sorry, I realized we've gone on to the next slide. We can just, okay. Yes, all I wanted to say is that apart from their names, all we know are their titles. Some of them are priests, some of them are just noted as sons and daughters, but all of them were wrapped in these bandages to help form their transition into the other life. This was their purpose originally, but what is their purpose to us today? Next slide, please. We unfortunately have no exact provenance for the linen fragments. The earliest record we have of them is from where they were acquired by Wellcome and his agents, which was the Mcgregor sale at Sotheby's in late June and early July of 1922. Reverend William Mcgregor owned one of the largest private collections of Egyptological material in his day, his connections having begun after his retirement from the church and trips to Egypt to revitalize his health. He became involved with the Egypt Exploration Fund, the modern-day EES, and was the financial backer of digs led by the likes of Flinders Petrie and John Garstang. The linen fragments were sold in lots 523 and 524, as you can see their description from the sale catalogue on the right-hand side of the screen. These descriptions let us know that already by this time, they had already been cut up and backed onto the old card. Whether this was Mcgregor's own doing or how he acquired them is unknown. Wellcome himself was present at this sale under the pseudonym of Wilton, along with a number of his agents. Altogether, they purchased over 1/4 of all the lots in the sale, spending over £1,649 at the time. Adjusted for inflation, this is £95,000 in today's money. To put that into context, there we go. To put that into context, that total value that was earned from the sale was £34,000 in 1922. That's roughly equivalent to £1.9 million today, with an average spent of £18.14 per lot, or £1,000 today, or £3.18 per object, which is about £230 today. It's worth noting then that this was a rich man's fancy or obsession, and it was an obsession predicated upon the disruption, destruction, and fragmentation of things, their commodification and collecting for the fancy of the individuals and the whims of the marketplace. This fragmentation ensured all who could pay got a piece, irrespective of its wholeness or original purpose. And it's worth bearing in mind that only a few months later, with the discovery of Tutankhamun, this would only magnify. Last slide, please. If you find this last slide's information a bit overwhelming, that's very much the point. This fragmentation is very much still persists into the present, and this is only just for this one case study. In total, 104 linen fragments across Europe and North America, notably none in Egypt, attest the same names. What isn't clear is whether these fragments are held by institutions or within private collections, but either way, the situation is the same. They're secreted away, as they had been back in their original context, but they are now dismembered and dispersed. Where once their numbers were to signify their place in the embalming of the deceased, they now carry numbers that note their place in a case or a storeroom. Their story is now no longer just a story about a journey across the other world, but a journey across space and time. So I leave you with just some open questions. What's to be done with them today? Who should decide? We could piece them back together, but the fact remains is that they would not be the same. The destruction has already been done, and how we contextualize that at the present, I believe, is a very important question to be considered going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And just to reiterate the comment in the chat just now, it's definitely worthwhile a second hearing. And clearly a very emotional subject and a very difficult subject to talk about. So thank you very much for raising it. I'm sure there will be some questions for the UCL team or for other people that we may want to come back to. I was actually going to ask about the question of fragmentation that you've just raised, and whether before we have resolved the question of who should be responsible for that, there are things we can do digitally to bring that kind of material back together. How can we encourage that?
I mean, it is very much an open question, because I don't think any one of us can have all the answers. I think this is something that collectively as a discipline, we really have to reflect upon. And my hope from making that point at the end was to highlight the ways in which, even to this day, the decisions that were made decades ago that gave us the things that we work with now still have an effect and still permeate in the ways of what they, thinking of the right words, of what was the intent at the time, which is that these were objects of fancy. And now to try and piece them back together, I think there's a really good book by Christina Riggs, who's already been mentioned once at this conference, called Unwrapping Ancient Egypt. And that really dissects the whole kind of issue of unwrappings and the context to both in ancient times, but also in more modern times. And she really takes to task, I think, the nature of how our unwrapping of mummies or mummified remains, sorry, and the kind of destruction that causes as a result, that ripping away of secrets. As you saw at the start of the slide, the quote, "the cast-off clothing of the gods," actually comes from, I believe, a Ptolemaic inscription. It refers to how for the mummification process, the wrappings were treated as a new form to the deceased. That was their transformation into another life. But by the process of unwrapping them and dissecting the pieces onto old card and disseminating them, we've literally torn a piece away from them. And again, like I said, that damage can't be undone. So I think, to kind of wrap it back and to kind of start to answer your question, like you said, there are digital options as to how we can reunite these pieces. And I do think it would be interesting to try and reunite them to see if we can make some sense of wholeness again. But it is on the understanding that we can never truly reverse all the damage. So instead, what it should really teach us is about the damage that was caused and why, and how we go about addressing that. And I think part of going about addressing that is by returning the agency of those objects to the people to which that agency should have always belonged, which is the Egyptians. But that's my belief.
Thank you. A follow-up question has come in the meantime on, I guess, more of a practical aspect of the same question from somebody working on a similar collection of dispersed mummy bandage fragments associated with the Thomas Phillips Library, who would be interested in hearing how you're storing the data and what you hope to do about it.
So in terms of storing the data, so how we went about this project is, because it was remote for myself and Daniel, we basically used the online collections database to insert all the data and cross-referencing it with the Wellcome database to find and match up the original Wellcome numbers with our numbers. And the notes that we found included, for instance, the details about these other places that had these fragments. One thing that I'm currently still unsure about, like I said, is whether these are in institutions or in private collections. There are citations for these, but I haven't had the chance to access them yet because they are kind of obscure references, but they are out there. And that is something that I hope, and I've spoken to Anna about possibly revisiting in the next few months. And what we would like to do is, along with the ones that we do care for in the Petrie Museum, looking to see if these are in other institutions, and from there possibly reaching out and possibly writing follow-up blog posts about it to try and start this maybe process of wider thinking of discussion of this defragmentation, let's say. You know, to use another jargon word, because why not? We love doing that as academics. Sorry, but yes, that's where I'm at right now. So at the moment, it's all just in the spreadsheet. But as we may take it forward into another sort of mini project of its own, we'll see. But that's where it's at right now.
And I think this conference is a sort of witness to the importance of gathering together to talk about these things. You may have seen Ken has posted in the chat to a fragment of linen at the Egypt Centre, which may or may not be connected, but it's only through events like these really that you get to hear about some of this material.
Detective work, it's great.
Yeah. I've got another question for you, Carl, which I'm just going to read out because it's quite long. So firstly, saying excellent talk. I think everybody's stayed to the end to listen to you. Currently, there are some anti-collector feelings amongst some Egyptologists. Aside from the fact that we can't change the past, this view arguably pushes private collectors and their collections further underground. If we instead collaborate with them, we could have a greater chance of virtually, if not physically, reuniting the dispersed pieces. how feasible do you think it would be to put out a public call for collectors with possible pieces of your fragments to get in touch?
Oh, okay, that's a very difficult question because I think this does very much come down to, at the end of the day, you are caught in this very difficult place. And I want to make clear that I don't personally judge any academic who has engaged with collectors before. I can understand the passion and the desire to study an object and to kind of contextualize it. The issue that arises is that by dealing with collectors and by studying the objects they hold and possibly verifying them, that only legitimates the further on sale of these objects. So by you saying that, yes, this is legitimate, they can then put that in a catalog and potentially resell it for more money. So really, it only propagates the wider damage that is caused by the continued sale of these objects into private hands. So while in an ideal world, yes, I would like to be able to put a public call out and say, yes, I would like to work with you. I personally, and I can only speak for myself, I want to make that clear as well. I can't say that I would feel comfortable doing that because, again, I do not, under any circumstances, want to legitimate this form of private collecting and trading because to me, it's not right. So I'm sorry, that probably wasn't the answer you were looking for, but I feel like I had to be honest there. I hope you understand. But yeah, those are my reasons.
I should also say that reflects the Petrie Museum's stance, generally speaking, as well. But that really fantastic answer, Kyle. Really fantastic.
I've got lots